NASCAR will fine you $100,000 for a loose lug nut. But back in the day, teams were literally cheating physics. And the sport pretended not to notice until someone almost died. These aren't your typical, oh no, the car's too low violations. We're talking about tricks so dangerous, so brilliant, and so completely unhinged that NASCAR had to rewrite the rulebook just to make sure nobody ever tried them again. Let's get into it. Number 5. The nitrous oxide ghost picture. It's 1983, and you're watching a race at Daytona. A mid-pack car suddenly rockets past the leader like he's standing still. No draft, no slingshot, just pure, unexplainable acceleration. The announcer's confused. The pit crew's confused. Even the driver looks a little too excited for someone who just found an extra 100 horsepower out of nowhere. That's because he did. And it came from a tank hidden in the roll cage. Nitrous oxide. The same stuff your dentist uses to make you forget about drilling. In racing, it does something way more interesting. It dumps extra oxygen into your combustion chamber, letting you burn more fuel, creating more power. It's common. In NASCAR, it's about as legal as bringing a gun to a knife fight. The beauty of nitrous back then was its invisibility. No visible modifications. No weird exhaust smoke. Just a button on the steering wheel, and suddenly your restrictor plate engine is breathing like it's got a pair of fresh lungs. Teams would hide the bottles inside frame rails, behind dashboards, even inside fake fire extinguishers. NASCAR inspectors in the early 80s weren't exactly running chemical analysis on every component. They were checking ride height and engine displacement, not playing CSI Miami with spectrometers. But here's where it gets sketchy. Nitrous doesn't just give you power. It gives you unpredictable power. Hit the button mid-corner and congratulations. You just turned your stock car into a land missile with the handling characteristics of a shopping cart. Several drivers reported cars in front of them suddenly snapping sideways for no apparent reason, only to recover and keep going. That wasn't divine intervention. That was Bobby's thumb slipping off the nitrous button at 180 miles per hour. The final straw came at Talladega in 1983. A car in the middle of the pack had what officials called a catastrophic engine failure. The engine didn't just blow, it essentially exploded. Pieces of the block punched through the hood. The car filled with smoke. The driver barely got it stopped before the whole thing turned into a rolling barbecue. When NASCAR tore down the engine, they found residue that didn't belong. Chemical compounds consistent with nitrous oxide combustion. Empty, of course. The team claimed it was for tire pressure adjustments. Right. Because nothing says precise tire inflation like a system designed to make dentists' patients stop caring about reality. NASCAR's response was immediate and brutal. They banned nitrous oxide in any form. For any reason, they started doing random teardowns mid-season, sometimes without warning. And they made it clear that if they even suspected you had nitrous, they'd strip your car down to the frame in front of the entire garage, just to make an example. The kicker? NASCAR never officially announced which team got caught. No press release. No public shaming. Just a quiet rule change, and suddenly everyone stopped having mysterious acceleration bursts. That's how you know it was widespread. When NASCAR buries something that deep, it means the sport's biggest names were involved, and admitting it would have made the whole series look like a joke. Number 4. The acid-dipped body panel's weight is everything in racing. Less weight means faster acceleration, better handling, and quicker lap times. NASCAR has minimum weight requirements for exactly this reason. You can't just show up with a car made of aluminum foil and dreams. But what if your car looked legal, felt legal, and weighed legal during inspection, but lost 50 pounds? The moment you hit the track. Welcome to the acid bath technique. This one's straight out of a chemistry thriller. Teams in the late 70s figured out that if you dip steel body panels in a mild acid solution, you can dissolve just enough of the metal's inner structure to reduce weight without changing its appearance. We're not talking about dunking the whole car in a vat. That'd be obvious. This was precision work, strategic acid application on non-critical areas. The stuff inspectors wouldn't think to check closely. The doors were a favorite target. NASCAR requires steel doors for safety, but nobody said they had to be full-thickness steel. A door panel that's been acid-treated looks completely normal, sounds normal when you tap it, even weighs close to normal because the outer skin is still intact. But the internal structure? Swiss cheese. The metal's been compromised just enough to shed 15, maybe 20 pounds per door. The same trick worked on roof panels, quarter panels, even floor sections. Anywhere you could treat the metal without creating an obvious weak point. And here's the genius part. The acid treatment was temporary. Over time, exposure to air and moisture would actually restore some of the metal's integrity through oxidation. So even if NASCAR impounded your car after the race for inspection, the panels might test closer to normal by the time they got around to checking. The technique required serious chemistry knowledge. Too much acid and the panel would collapse under race loads. Not enough and you weren't saving meaningful weight. Teams started hiring actual metallurgists as consultants. These weren't mechanics who learned on the job. These were PhD-level scientists figuring out the exact molarity of sulfuric acid needed to compromise 1960s American steel without destroying it. It all came crashing down, literally, at Charlotte in 1979. A car made contact with the wall, nothing major, just a scrape. The door caved in like it was made of cardboard. The driver was fine, but when safety crews pulled him out, they noticed something weird. The door panel felt wrong, too flexible, too thin in spots. NASCAR impounded the car immediately. When they examined it, they found that the door's internal structure had been severely weakened. The outer skin was fine, but everything underneath was compromised. They tested other panels. Same story. The car was essentially a painted eggshell on wheels. The investigation expanded. They started pulling random cars from the garage for spot checks. They'd weigh panels individually, test metal thickness, even run chemical analysis on the steel. What they found was an industry-wide epidemic. Nearly a third of the teams they checked had some form of chemically altered bodywork. NASCAR's solution was characteristically extreme. They mandated that all body panels had to come from NASCAR-approved suppliers. No more custom fabrication. No more we just happened to find really light steel. Every panel got serialized. Inspectors started carrying metal thickness gauges, and they implemented a rule that still exists today. If any body panel fails structural integrity tests, the entire car is disqualified and the team gets suspended. The really wild part? NASCAR never publicly identified which teams were involved. They just quietly implemented new rules and moved on. But if you go back and look at lap times from 1979 compared to 1980, suddenly, a lot of mid-pack cars got slower. Not because the drivers got worse, but because their cars suddenly weighed what they were supposed to. Number 3. The magnetic fuel cell fuel is heavy. A full tank in a NASCAR stock car weighs over 100 pounds. That's 100 pounds sitting high in the chassis, affecting handling, especially in the corners. But what if you could move that weight around during the race? Not physically relocating the tank, that's impossible. But changing where the fuel sits inside the tank, that's just clever engineering. Or in NASCAR's eyes, that's cheating so advanced it borders on witchcraft. The setup was diabolical in its simplicity. Teams would install electromagnets inside the fuel cell, hidden in the baffles and structural supports where they wouldn't be noticed during inspection. These magnets were connected to a switch on the dashboard, totally invisible to officials. During straightaways, the magnets were off and fuel sloshed around normally. But entering a corner, flip the switch and the magnets would pull the fuel to one side of the tank. Why does this matter? Because in NASCAR, especially on oval tracks, you're constantly turning left. If you can bias your fuel weight to the right side of the car during left turns, you're effectively adding weight to the outside of the turn, which improves grip and cornering speed. It's like having adjustable ballast that responds in real time to track conditions. The fuel had to be specially formulated with iron particles suspended in solution. Not enough to change the fuel's combustion properties. NASCAR tested for that, but enough to respond to magnetic fields. Teams worked with chemical engineers to find the perfect balance. Too much iron, and the fuel wouldn't burn right. Too little, and the magnets wouldn't work. The system gave teams maybe 0.2 of a second per lap. Doesn't sound like much until you realize that over a 500-lap race, that's 100 seconds. Nearly 2 minutes. In a sport where races are often decided by less than a second, this was a nuclear weapon disguised as a pocket knife. Here's how NASCAR caught on. An engineer at one of the smaller teams noticed something odd in telemetry data. Cars from certain teams were cornering faster than their setup should allow. Not dramatically faster, but consistently faster. Like they had more grip than physics said they should have. He couldn't figure it out until he noticed the pattern only appeared on tracks with lots of left-hand turns. Road courses? No advantage. Oval tracks? Suddenly these cars were handling like they were on rails. The engineer took his suspicions to NASCAR. They started investigating. The breakthrough came when an inspector, during a routine post-race teardown, happened to pass a magnetic parts tray near a fuel cell. The tray stuck to the cell's exterior. That shouldn't happen. Fuel cells are made of non-magnetic materials for safety reasons. They cut the fuel cell open. Inside they found a network of electromagnets, wiring, and a control system sophisticated enough to make Tesla engineers jealous. The team tried to claim it was part of a fuel-level sensing system. NASCAR didn't buy it. They tested the fuel and found iron content way above natural levels. The fallout was unprecedented. NASCAR didn't just ban the system. They mandated transparent fuel cells for all inspections. Teams had to prove their cells contained no magnetic materials. They also started testing fuel samples for iron content, and they implemented a rule that any modifications to the fuel cell, even for legitimate purposes, required pre-approval and documentation. But here's the thing that really scared NASCAR. This wasn't some shade tree mechanic's backyard experiment. This required serious engineering. Electromagnetic systems, custom fuel formulations, real-time control mechanisms. This was Formula One level innovation being used to cheat in what's supposed to be a stock car series. It meant teams were spending millions on cheating technology, and doing it so well that NASCAR didn't catch it for years. They never announced which teams were involved. But if you go back and watch races from the mid-90s, right before NASCAR implemented the transparent fuel cell rule, you'll notice certain cars suddenly got a lot less competitive in the corners. That wasn't driver error. That was gravity finally working the way it's supposed to. Number 2. The spectroscopic oil. Oil is oil, right? It lubricates. It cools. It keeps your engine from turning into an expensive paperweight. NASCAR doesn't care much about what oil you use as long as it meets basic specifications. They're not running chemical analysis on your fluids before every race. They've got bigger things to worry about. Except in the early 2000s, some teams figured out that oil could be so much more than just oil. It could be an octane booster that left no trace. The scheme worked like this. Teams would use a specially formulated oil that contained dissolved chemical compounds, essentially race fuel additives hidden in the lubricant. These compounds would stay in the oil. But under the extreme heat and pressure of race conditions, tiny amounts would vaporize, get pulled into the combustion chamber through the PCV system, and boost octane levels. The effect was small but real, maybe 5 to 10 extra horsepower. Not enough to win a race outright, but enough to be the difference between leading a lap and finishing second. And because the compounds were oil-soluble, they wouldn't show up in fuel tests. NASCAR tested fuel religiously. They'd pull samples, run them through gas chromatography, check for banned additives. But oil? Nobody was checking oil. The genius was in the formulation. These weren't crude additives. Teams worked with petroleum chemists to develop compounds that would vaporize at specific temperatures, only under race loads. During inspection, when the engine was cold, the oil was just oil. Fire it up and run it hard, and suddenly you're getting a chemical boost that's completely invisible to traditional testing methods. It worked for years. Teams passed tech inspection with flying colors. Their fuel tested clean. Their engines, when torn down, showed no illegal modifications. Everything looked legal because technically there was no rule against what type of oil you used. NASCAR's rulebook covered fuel, covered engine specs, covered just about everything except the chemical composition of your motor oil. The trick fell apart because of an accident. A car blew an engine at Martinsville in 2004. Not unusual, engines blow sometimes. And the cleanup crew noticed something weird. The oil smoke had a strange smell. Not burnt oil. Something else. Chemical. Sharp. One of the safety workers mentioned it to a NASCAR official. The official thought it was odd enough to investigate. They collected oil samples from the wreck, sent them to a lab. What came back was shocking. The oil contained compounds that had no business being in motor oil. Chemicals typically found in high-octane race fuel. But they were there. And when the lab ran combustion tests, they found that under heat, These compounds vaporized and would absolutely boost octane if they made it into the combustion chamber. NASCAR launched a quiet investigation. They started pulling oil samples from random cars, sending them for analysis without telling teams. What they found suggested this wasn't an isolated incident. Multiple teams had enhanced oils. Different formulations, different chemicals, but the same principle. Use oil as a delivery system for performance-enhancing compounds. The crackdown was swift. NASCAR added oil to their list of controlled substances. Teams had to use approved oils from approved suppliers. No more custom blends. No more "we developed this specifically for our engines." If it's not on the approved list, it's not going in the car. They also started doing random oil analysis, pulling samples without warning, testing for anything that didn't belong. And just like the other buried scandals, NASCAR never said which teams were involved. No announcements, no penalties that made headlines, just quiet rule changes. And suddenly everyone's using the same Mobil 1 from the same barrel. But you know what's interesting? Horsepower numbers across the series dropped by about 3 to 5% after the new oil rules took effect. That's not coincidence. That's everyone losing their chemical advantage at the same time. Number 1. The liquid-cooled tires. This is the big one. The trick's so dangerous, so fundamentally insane, that when NASCAR found out about it, they didn't just ban it. They retroactively disqualified every race where they suspected it was used and threatened lifetime bans for anyone involved. We're talking about liquid-cooled tires. Tire temperature is everything in NASCAR. Too cold and you don't have grip. Too hot and the rubber starts to break down. You lose grip, and eventually the tire fails. And managing it is one of the most critical aspects of race strategy. But what if you could keep your tires in that sweet spot artificially? Maintain perfect temperature regardless of conditions. Teams figured out how to run coolant lines through the wheel hubs and into channels cut into the wheel itself, right up against the tire bead. The coolant would circulate through these channels, pulling heat away from the tire, keeping temperatures stable even under heavy loads. The system was connected to the car's existing cooling system, so it didn't require separate pumps or radiators that would be obvious during inspection. The modification required precision machining. The wheel had to be hollowed out just enough to create coolant channels without compromising structural integrity. The channels had to be sealed perfectly because coolant leak would be catastrophically obvious. And the whole system had to be hidden well enough that inspectors wouldn't notice extra coolant lines or modified hubs. The advantage was enormous. While other cars were managing tire temperatures through driving style and pit strategy, these cars could push harder longer, without worrying about overheating their tires. They could run more aggressive setups, take corners faster and not pay the usual penalty of excessive tire wear. It worked until it didn't. At Daytona in 2007, a car came into the pits with smoke pouring from the wheel wells. Not tire smoke. Something else. Coolant smoke. A seal had failed, and coolant was spraying onto the hot brake rotors, creating a cloud of sweet-smelling vapor. The crew tried to play it off as a brake issue, but NASCAR officials weren't stupid. They impounded the car immediately, pulled the wheels, found the channels, traced the coolant lines. The whole system was right there, impossible to deny. The team tried to claim it was an experimental cooling system for the brakes. NASCAR didn't care. They tore into the team's hauler, found machining equipment, found modified wheels, found documentation showing this had been going on for months. What came next was the closest thing NASCAR has ever done to a public execution. They stripped the team of every championship point from the season, suspended the crew chief indefinitely, fined the team owner $1 million, and they launched an investigation into every other team in the garage, looking for the same modification. They found it, but enough places to make it clear this was spreading. Teams were sharing information, refining the technique, pushing the boundaries of what they could get away with. NASCAR's response was to completely redesign their wheel inspection process. They started using thermal imaging cameras to look for temperature anomalies. They mandated specific wheel designs that couldn't be easily modified. They even started drilling test holes in random wheels during inspection to verify they were solid. But the real punishment came in the history books. NASCAR went back through race data and identified every race where teams with liquid-cooled tires had competed. They noted which teams showed tire temperature patterns that didn't match normal physics. And while they couldn't prove anything definitively, They made it known that those results were suspect. Championships that were won during this era carry an asterisk in the minds of fans who know what was happening. The wildest part about all this: the technology actually worked. Engineers who've studied the system say it was brilliant. Completely illegal, but brilliant. In another series, one with different rules, this kind of innovation might have been celebrated. But NASCAR isn't Formula One. The whole point is stock cars. Working with what you're given, not reinventing thermodynamics in your spare time. Here's what connects all 5 of these tricks. They weren't crude. They weren't obvious. These were sophisticated engineering solutions developed by smart people who found gaps in the rulebook and exploited them with precision. NASCAR had to ban these tricks, not because they were easy to catch, but because they were almost impossible to catch until something went wrong. And that's the real story here. NASCAR's rulebook isn't just about keeping competition fair. It's about keeping drivers alive. Every one of these tricks introduced variables that could turn dangerous in an instant. Nitrous making cars unpredictable. Acid-weakened body panels collapsing on impact. Magnetic fuel cells failing mid-corner. Oil additives causing engine failures. Coolant leaks creating slip hazards on the track. The teams that developed these tricks knew the risks. They did it anyway because winning matters more than safety when you're fighting for championship points and sponsorship dollars. NASCAR had to bury these stories, because admitting how widespread the cheating was would have destroyed the sport's credibility. But the evidence is there if you know where to look. Rule changes that seem random. Safety mandates that appear out of nowhere. Teams that suddenly stop being competitive for no apparent reason. That's not evolution. That's NASCAR plugging holes in a dam that keeps springing leaks. And somewhere in a shop right now, an engineer is looking at the current rulebook, finding the next gap, and figuring out how to exploit it without getting caught. Because that's racing. The rules are just suggestions until you get caught. And even then, you only get caught if someone talks or something breaks at exactly the wrong time. These 5 tricks, they're not history, they're blueprints. And the next generation of cheaters is taking notes.